Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, today I want to talk to you about a virtue that is rare in this world but precious in the eyes of God, the courage to stand alone. We live in a time when the crowd pulls us in every direction. The world tells us to follow the trends, to blend in, to do whatever it takes to be accepted. But the question is, who will stand for what is right when no one else will? Who will refuse to compromise when the cost is high? Who will walk the narrow road, even if they must walk it alone? Throughout history, we see that the greatest men and women of faith were often called to stand alone. Noah stood alone in obedience while the world around him mocked. Daniel stood alone in the lion's den because he would not bow. Esther stood alone before the king, risking her life to save her people. And let's not forget the one who stood alone on the cross, bearing the weight of the world's sin, rejected and despised by men, yet victorious in the eyes of heaven. My friends, there comes a moment in every life when we must decide, will we follow the crowd or will we stand for what is right? Will we compromise our convictions or will we remain faithful? Let me tell you, the easy road is crowded, but the road of righteousness is often lonely. Some of you may be facing that moment right now. You may be the only one in your workplace who refuses to cut corners, the only student in your school who won't cheat, the only person in your family who chooses faith over fear. And it's not easy, it's not comfortable. But let me remind you, the strength to stand alone does not come from within ourselves. It comes from above. God does not call us to stand alone in our own power. He gives us His Spirit to strengthen us. When you feel weak, He is strong. When you feel afraid, He is your courage. When you feel abandoned, He is closer than a brother. So stand firm. Stand with courage. Stand even if no one else stands with you. Because when you stand for what is right, you are never truly alone. Heaven stands with you. The angels stand with you. And God Himself walks beside you. The world may reject you. Friends may turn away. But the applause of heaven is worth far more than the approval of man. So I ask you today, will you have the courage to stand alone? Standing alone is often the price of standing for what is right. It has been this way since the beginning of time. Those who choose to walk the path of truth and righteousness often find themselves walking it alone. It is not the popular road, it is not the easy road, and it is certainly not the road that will win you the approval of the world. But it is the road that leads to life. It is the road that leads to purpose, to destiny, and ultimately to victory. The world has always been uncomfortable with those who refuse to conform. The moment you decide to take a stand, expect opposition, expect resistance, expect to be misunderstood, ridiculed, and even rejected. But do not be discouraged, because you are in good company. The men and women who changed history, who shaped nations, who carried the truth in their hearts and refused to let go, were often those who stood. Noah stood alone when he built the ark, surrounded by a world that had given itself over to wickedness. He chose to obey God rather than follow the crowd. People mocked him, they laughed at him, they called him a fool. But Noah knew something they did not. He knew that when God speaks, obedience is more important than approval. The rain came, the floods rose, and when it was all over, the man who stood alone was the only one left standing. Abraham stood alone when he left his homeland. God called him to step out in faith, to leave behind everything that was familiar, everything that was comfortable, and to walk into the unknown. There were no road signs, no guarantees, no visible proof that he was making the right decision, but he walked anyway. Because when God calls, you don't need the approval of men, you need faith to obey. And because he stood alone in obedience, he became the father of many nations. And he became the king of faithful. Moses stood alone in Pharaoh's court. He could have stayed in the palace, enjoyed a life of luxury, and been respected among the Egyptians. But he chose instead to identify with the suffering people of God. He chose to stand against the most powerful ruler of his time, armed with nothing but a staff and the word of the Lord. Pharaoh laughed at him. The people doubted him. But Moses did not waver, because he knew that standing alone with God is better than standing with the world without Him. Both of them. Elijah stood alone on Mount Carmel. Surrounded by hundreds of false prophets, standing before a rebellious nation, he called down fire from heaven to prove that the Lord alone is God. He stood there, one man against many, not because he was strong, not because he was fearless, but because he knew that when you stand with God, you are never truly outnumbered. And in the end, the fire fell, the false prophets were silenced, and Elijah's stand for truth shook the nation. Esther stood alone before the king. She risked her life to speak up for her people, knowing that one wrong word could mean death. It would have been easier to remain silent. It would have been safer to stay hidden. But she chose courage over comfort. And because of her stand, an entire people was saved. Daniel stood alone in Babylon. He was a young man in a foreign land, surrounded by a culture that had no regard for his God. He was pressured to compromise, to bow to the idols of the day, to conform to the expectations of a godless society. But he refused. He would not eat their food. He would not bow to their gods. And when the decree was issued that no one could pray to any god but the king, he did not hide. He did not waver. He continued to pray just as he had always done. They threw him into the lion's den, but the same God he stood for was the God who stood with him, and in the morning he was still alive. The apostles stood alone in the early days of the church. They preached a message the world did not want to hear. They were beaten, imprisoned, and even put to death, but they would not stop. Why? Because they had seen the risen Christ. They had encountered a truth that was worth dying for, and no power on earth could make them deny it. John the Baptist stood alone in the wilderness. He was a voice crying out in the desert, preparing the way for the Lord. He was not dressed in fine clothes. He did not sit in the courts of kings. He did not seek the approval of men. He spoke the truth boldly, even when it cost him his life. And then, at the center of it all, there is the greatest example of all, Jesus Christ. He stood alone before the religious leaders of his day. He stood alone before Pilate. He stood alone in the garden, sweating drops of blood as his disciples slept. He stood alone on the cross, carrying the sin of the world on his shoulders. The crowd that once shouted his praises turned against him. The ones who followed him fled in fear. And yet he did not waver. He did not call down angels to rescue him. He did not step down from that cross. He endured the shame, the suffering, the rejection, because he knew that standing alone in obedience to the Father was the only way to redeem the world. This is the pattern we see throughout history. Those who change the world are not those who seek to blend in. They are not those who chase after popularity or the approval of men. They are those who have the courage to stand alone. They are those who fear God more than they fear man. They are those who know that compromise is easy, but conviction is costly. The world today is not much different from the world of Noah, of Moses, of Daniel. It still pressures us to conform. It still ridicules those who stand for truth. It still tries to silence those who refuse to bow. And the question before us is this: when the time comes, will we have the courage to stand alone? Standing alone is never easy. It can be lonely, it can be painful, but it is also the mark of true greatness. It is the path walked by the faithful, the path of the prophets, the apostles, the martyrs, and the Savior himself. It is the price of standing for what is right. The strength to stand alone comes from God, not ourselves. Human strength is limited. We grow tired, we grow weary, and we often feel the weight of standing alone pressing down on us. But when our strength fails, God's strength carries us. When we feel like we cannot go another step, He lifts us up. When we are weak, He is strong. And that is why those who stand for righteousness do not stand by their own might, but by the power of the one who called them. Throughout history, the greatest men and women of faith were not strong because of their own abilities. They were strong because they depended on God. They did not trust in their own wisdom, their own courage, or their own endurance. They trusted in the one who holds all things together. Noah did not build the ark by his own strength. The ridicule and opposition he faced would have been too much for any man. But he trusted in the voice of God, and that trust gave him the perseverance to complete his task. Moses did not confront Pharaoh because of his own boldness. In fact, he felt inadequate, afraid, and unqualified. But God's strength enabled him to stand before the most powerful ruler of his time and declare, "Let my people go." David did not face Goliath in his own strength. He was just a young shepherd, but he stepped forward with confidence, not because he trusted in himself, but because he trusted in the power of God. The world looks at strength as something that comes from within, something we must manufacture, something we must summon from deep inside ourselves. But true strength does not come from self-reliance. It comes from surrender. Surrendering to the power of God, surrendering to His will, surrendering to His Spirit. When we let go of our own pride, our own ego, our own illusion of control, that is when we experience the strength that never fails. The prophet Isaiah said, "Those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." That is the promise of God to those who trust in Him. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den not because of his own strength, but because he had the faith to stand. He could have chosen the easy path. He could have stopped praying in public. He could have conformed to the king's decree. But he chose to stand alone, knowing that God would be his strength. And in that den of lions, where no human strength could have saved him, the power of God shut the mouths of the beast. The three Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, stood before the fiery furnace, facing death for refusing to bow to an idol. They had no physical power to resist the decree of the king. They had no army to defend them. But they had faith in a God who was greater than the fire. And because they trusted in his strength, they walked in the flames without fear. Elijah stood alone on Mount Carmel, facing hundreds of false prophets who worshiped Baal. He was one man against an entire religious system that had turned away from God. He had no allies, no supporters, no human power to rely on. But he had something far greater. He had the presence of the Almighty. He prayed, and fire fell from heaven, proving that the strength to stand alone does not come from numbers, influence, or political power. It comes from faith in the God who never fails. Even Jesus, in his humanity, relied on the strength of the Father. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he knelt and prayed, sweating drops of blood as he prepared to face the cross. The weight of what was coming was unbearable. He was about to take on the sin of the world, to suffer rejection, humiliation, and death. And in that moment, he did not rely on human strength. He cried out to the Father, saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." And in that surrender, he found the strength to endure the cross, to carry the weight of our sin, to walk through suffering and death and emerge victorious. The apostles were not strong men by nature. They were fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary people. When Jesus was arrested, they scattered in fear. Peter, who had boldly declared that he would never deny Christ, was so afraid that he denied him 3 times. But after the resurrection, something changed. The power of the Holy Spirit came upon them, and these same men who had once been afraid now stood boldly before kings, preaching the gospel without fear. They were imprisoned, beaten, and even put to death, but they did not waver. They did not back down, because they were no longer standing in their own strength. They were standing in the power of God. Paul, one of the greatest apostles, understood this better than anyone. He had been shipwrecked, beaten, stoned, and imprisoned for the sake of the gospel, but he never lost heart, because he knew that his strength did not come from himself. He wrote, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." And he also said, "When I am weak, then I am strong." What kind of strength is that? It is the strength that does not depend on circumstances. It is the strength that does not crumble under pressure. It is the strength that comes from knowing that even in our weakest moments, God is still in control. There will be times in life when we feel like we cannot go on. Times when the pressure is too much, when the burden is too heavy, when the road ahead looks impossible. That is when we must remember where our strength comes from. It does not come from within. It does not come from our own ability to push through. It comes from the one who created the heavens and the earth, the one who holds the universe in his hands, the one who spoke and the stars appeared in the sky. That is the source of our strength. When you feel alone in your convictions, remember that God is with you. When you feel outnumbered, remember that he fights for you. When you feel weak, remember that his power is made perfect in weakness. The world will tell you to rely on yourself, to trust in your own strength, to be your own source of power. But the truth is, self-reliance will fail you. Human strength will fail you. But God never will. There is a reason why the enemy tries to make us feel isolated. He wants us to believe that we are standing alone, that we have to fight our battles by ourselves. But that is a lie. We are never truly alone. The same God who stood with Noah in the flood, with Moses at the Red Sea, with David on the battlefield, with Daniel in the lion's den, with Paul in the prison cell, that same God stands with us today. This is why the strength to stand alone does not come from ourselves. It comes from him. Throughout history, the greatest heroes of faith were willing to walk alone. They did not wait for the approval of the crowd. They did not hesitate when others turned away. They did not compromise their convictions to fit in. Instead, they walked forward in faith, even when it meant leaving everything behind. They chose obedience over popularity, faith over fear, and truth over comfort. And because they were willing to walk alone, they changed the course of history. Noah walked alone in a world consumed by sin. The people around him had given themselves over to wickedness, living only for their own desires. Violence, corruption, and immorality filled the earth, and no one cared about righteousness. But in the midst of it all, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He was given a command to build an ark, a command that made no sense to the people around him. They mocked him, ridiculed him, and dismissed him as a fool. Yet Noah did not let the opinions of the world shake his obedience to God. Day after day, year after year, he continued to build. He continued to believe. He continued to stand firm. And when the floodwaters came, the man who had walked alone was the only one left standing. Abraham walked alone when he left his homeland. God called him to leave behind everything he knew, his family, his culture, his security, and to go to a land that he would show him. There were no guarantees, no visible signs, no clear roadmap. But Abraham obeyed, even though it meant stepping into the unknown. He trusted in the promises of God, even when he had to wait for years to see them fulfilled. When God told him that he would become the father of many nations, he believed, even though he was old and his wife was barren. When God asked him to sacrifice his son Isaac, he obeyed, even when it seemed impossible to understand. Abraham walked alone, but his faith made him the father of a great nation. Moses walked alone when he stood before Pharaoh. He had been raised in the palace, educated in the ways of Egypt, and could have lived a life of privilege. But he chose instead to identify with the suffering people of God. He saw their oppression, their pain, and their cries for deliverance, and he could not remain silent. He left behind the luxury of Egypt and embraced the calling of God. When he stood before Pharaoh demanding the release of the Israelites, he had no army, no political power, and no support. Pharaoh scoffed at him. His own people doubted him, but Moses stood firm. With nothing but a staff in his hand and the word of the Lord in his heart, he led his people out of slavery and into freedom. Joseph walked alone in the prison cell, betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and thrown into prison. He had every reason to be bitter, to be angry, to give up. But Joseph did not allow his circumstances to define his faith. He remained steadfast, faithful, and obedient, even in the darkest moments of his life. When the time came, God raised him up to be the second in command over all of Egypt. Joseph walked alone to the cemetery of prophets. The very brothers who had betrayed him came to him for help, and he forgave them. What they meant for evil, God used for good. Joseph walked alone, but God's purpose was never far from him. Elijah walked alone on Mount Carmel in a time when the nation of Israel had turned to idolatry, when false prophets filled the land and the people wavered between serving God and serving Baal. Elijah stood as a lone voice for truth. He confronted the prophets of Baal, challenging them to call down fire from heaven. They cried out, they danced, they cut themselves, but no fire came. Then Elijah stepped forward, prayed to the Lord, and fire fell from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the altar, and even the water that had been poured around it. The people saw and fell on their faces, declaring that the Lord is God. One man stood alone, and through him an entire nation was brought back to the truth. Esther walked alone before the king. She was just an ordinary Jewish girl, placed in an extraordinary position. When a plot was revealed to destroy her people, she was faced with a choice: remain silent and save herself, or risk everything to speak up. The law was clear. Approaching the king without being summoned could mean death. But she knew that God had placed her in that position for a reason. With courage and faith, she went before the king, exposed the wicked plot, and saved her people from destruction. Because she was willing to stand alone, an entire generation was preserved. Daniel walked alone in Babylon. He was taken captive as a young man, forced to live in a foreign land with foreign customs and foreign gods. Yet he refused to compromise. When he was told to eat the king's food, he refused. When he was commanded to bow before the king, he refused. When he was forbidden to pray to his God, he continued to pray as he always had. His faithfulness led him to the lion's den, but the same God he stood for was the God who shut the mouths of the lions. Daniel's courage to walk alone made him a testimony of God's power. John the Baptist walked alone in the wilderness. He was not dressed in royal robes. He did not dine in the palaces of kings. He lived in the desert, clothed in camel's hair, eating locusts and honey. But he was the voice crying out, preparing the way for the Lord. He spoke the truth boldly, calling people to repentance, confronting sin, and pointing to the Messiah. Many rejected him. The religious leaders opposed him, and eventually he was imprisoned and beheaded for his stand. Yet Jesus himself said that among those born of women there was none greater than John. The early disciples walked alone in a hostile world. After Jesus ascended to heaven, they were left to carry the message of the gospel into a world that did not want to hear it. They were beaten, imprisoned, and persecuted, but they did not stop. They were rejected by society, yet they rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. They turned the world upside down, not because they had power or influence, but because they had the boldness to walk alone in faith. And then, at the center of it all, there is Jesus. He walked alone in the garden while his disciples slept. He walked alone before Pilate while the crowd cried out for his crucifixion. He walked alone to the cross, carrying the weight of our sin and shame. The world rejected him, the religious leaders despised him, and even his closest friends abandoned him. Yet, he endured it all. He bore the suffering, the shame, and the rejection because he knew that his sacrifice would bring salvation to the world. Time and time again we see that those who made the greatest impact were willing to walk alone. They did not seek the approval of the world. They did not wait for others to join them. They did not compromise when the pressure was great. They simply obeyed, trusted, and followed the call of God, no matter the cost. The opposition of the world is inevitable when you choose to stand for truth. From the beginning of time, those who have stood for righteousness have faced resistance. The world does not welcome those who speak against its ways. It does not applaud those who refuse to conform. It does not celebrate those who live by a higher standard. Instead, it fights against them, trying to silence their voices, break their spirits, and force them into submission. This is the cost of standing alone. It is the price of living for something greater than the approval of men. When you decide to walk the path of truth, you will find yourself in opposition to the world. The values you uphold will be mocked. The convictions you stand by will be ridiculed. The faith you live out will be challenged. The world does not tolerate those who stand for what is right. It demands conformity, and when you refuse to bow, it demands against you. It happened to the prophets of old. It happened to the apostles. It happened to Jesus himself, and it will happen to anyone who chooses to stand on the side of righteousness. Noah faced opposition when he obeyed God's command to build the ark. The people around him had never seen rain, and they could not understand why he was preparing for something they believed would never happen. They mocked him, laughed at him, and dismissed him as a foolish man, wasting his time. But Noah did not waver. He continued to build, continued to preach, and continued to warn of the coming judgment. The opposition did not stop him because he was not seeking their approval. He was obeying the voice of God. Moses faced opposition when he confronted Pharaoh. The most powerful ruler in the world scoffed at him, rejecting his demands and increasing the suffering of the Israelites. Even his own people questioned him, doubting that God had truly sent him. But Moses did not back down. He stood before Pharaoh again and again, declaring the word of the Lord, refusing to compromise, refusing to be intimidated. The opposition was fierce, but he remained faithful, and in the end it was Pharaoh's power that crumbled, while Moses led the people to freedom. Elijah faced opposition when he challenged the prophets of Baal. The nation of Israel had turned to idol worship, following the influence of a corrupt king and queen. Elijah stood alone, calling the people to return to God. The false prophets outnumbered him. The political leaders despised him, and the people were uncertain. But Elijah did not back down. He stood on Mount Carmel, defying the false gods, calling on the power of the true God. And when fire fell from heaven, it silenced the opposition, proving that one man standing with God is greater than any multitude standing against him. Daniel faced opposition when he remained faithful to prayer. The king's decree forbade anyone from praying to any god except the king himself. But Daniel would not bow to the law of man when it conflicted with the law of God. He continued to pray, knowing full well that his enemies were watching, waiting for a reason to condemn him. And when they found their opportunity, they had him thrown into the lion's den. But the opposition did not win. God shut the mouths of the lions, and the same men who had plotted against Daniel were the ones who met destruction. The early church faced opposition from religious leaders and political authorities. The apostles were arrested, beaten, and threatened for preaching the gospel. They were told to be silent, to stop speaking in the name of Jesus. But they could not be silenced. They declared, "We must obey God rather than men." They continued to preach, even when it meant imprisonment, even when it meant death. The opposition could not stop them because their faith was stronger than their fear. Paul faced opposition everywhere he went. He was stoned, beaten, shipwrecked, and imprisoned for the sake of the gospel. He was rejected by his own people, betrayed by false brothers, and pursued by those who sought to kill him. But he never wavered. He never stopped preaching, never stopped traveling, never stopped writing to strengthen the churches. He understood that opposition was part of the calling. He knew that standing for truth meant standing against the forces of the world. And because he remained faithful, his letters continue to impact the world today. Jesus faced the greatest opposition of all. He came to his own, but his own did not receive him. The religious leaders despised him because he exposed their hypocrisy. The crowds who once followed him turned against him when he did not meet their expectations. The Roman authorities saw him as a threat and sentenced him to die. He was betrayed by one of his closest followers, abandoned by the rest, and condemned by the rest people he came to save. He was mocked, beaten, and crucified. The world did everything it could to silence him. But even in death he overcame. The grave could not hold him, and the opposition that sought to destroy him became the very means by which salvation was brought to the world. This is the reality of standing for truth. The world will push against you, it will question you, attack you, and try to wear you down. It will tempt you to compromise, to give in, to take the easy way out. It will try to convince you that standing alone is not worth the cost. But the opposition of the world is not a sign that you are on the wrong path. It is a sign that you are walking the path of those who came before you. The path of the faithful, the path of Christ himself. The enemy does not waste his time on those who conform to the world. He does not attack those who stay silent, who blend in, who avoid making waves, but he will fight against those who stand boldly for the truth. He will use every tactic, fear, doubt, intimidation, persecution, to try to make them retreat. But he cannot defeat those who stand in the power of God. The battle is not fought in human strength. It is fought in the strength of the Lord. When opposition comes, do not be surprised. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. The apostles rejoiced when they were persecuted because they knew they were sharing in the suffering of Christ. The early Christians faced lions in the arena with songs of praise on their lips. Missionaries have been imprisoned. Martyrs have been burned at the stake. Believers have been ridiculed, slandered, and rejected. But the truth has never been silenced. The opposition of the world is temporary. The victory of God is eternal. The world will tell you to keep your faith private, to stay quiet, to not make waves. It will tell you that standing for righteousness is too costly, too difficult, too lonely. It will try to wear you down until you give in. But the ones who make a difference are the ones who refuse to bend. The ones who change the world are the ones who stand firm. They are not moved by fear. They are not shaken by opposition. They know that the world's rejection is nothing compared to God's approval. Every great move of God in history has faced opposition. Every revival, every awakening, every step forward in the kingdom of God has come with resistance. But the power of God has always been greater. The world may rage, but it cannot stop the truth. It may fight, but it cannot win against the plans of God. It may oppose, but it cannot overcome. There is a strength that comes only from standing alone. It is not the strength that comes from numbers, nor the strength that comes from the approval of others. It is the strength that is forged in the fire of solitude, in the trials of rejection, in the silence of isolation. It is the strength of the soul that has learned to rely on nothing but the truth, to stand on nothing but faith, to move forward with nothing but conviction. It is the strength that is born when all other supports are removed, when all other voices fade, when all that remains is the certainty of what is right. The strongest men and women in history were those who did not depend on the validation of the world. They were not swayed by public opinion. They did not need applause to keep going. They did not seek approval before taking a step of faith. Their strength came from within, from something deeper than the shifting tides of human praise. They were willing to walk alone because they understood that true strength is not found in following the crowd, but in standing firm when the crowd walks away. Noah found strength when he stood alone in obedience to God. He did not have a community of believers to support him. He did not have a congregation to encourage him. He did not have a mentor to guide him. He only had the word of the Lord and the faith to believe it. The world around him had given itself over to wickedness. The people mocked him, ridiculed him, dismissed him as a fool. Yet he continued to build the ark. He continued to warn of the coming judgment. He continued to trust in what he had heard, even when the skies were clear and there was no sign of rain. His strength was not in the approval of men, but in the unshakable foundation of faith. Abraham found strength when he left his homeland to follow God's call. He was not given a map. He was not given a detailed plan. He was only told to go. He left behind his family, his security, his comfort, and walked into the unknown. The strength to take that step did not come from human logic. It did not come from the assurance of others. It came from the certainty that God's promises were true. And when he was tested again, when he was asked to sacrifice his son, the strength to obey came from the same unshakable faith. He did not rely on understanding, he relied on trust. Moses found strength when he stood before Pharaoh demanding the release of his people. He was not a great speaker. He was not a natural leader. He had spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep far removed from the power and influence of Egypt. Yet, when God called him, he stood. He faced the most powerful ruler in the world and spoke the words of the Lord. He did not have an army behind him. He did not have political support. He only had a staff in his hand and the presence of God beside him. His strength was not in his abilities, but in his obedience. David found strength when he stood alone against Goliath. The entire army of Israel trembled in fear, unwilling to face the giant. The king himself had no solution. David was just a shepherd boy, young and inexperienced. But his strength was not in his size, nor in his skill with a sword. It was in his unwavering confidence in God. He did not hesitate. He did not wait for someone else to step forward. He ran toward the battle with nothing but a sling and 5 smooth stones, knowing that God was with him. Elijah found strength when he stood alone on Mount Carmel. The nation of Israel had turned away from God, following after false idols. The prophets of Baal filled the land, supported by the king and queen. But Elijah did not waver. He called the people to make a choice. He stood alone against hundreds of false prophets, challenging them to call upon their gods. And when no answer came, he called upon the Lord, and fire fell from heaven. His strength was not in numbers, not in popularity, not in human power. It was in the absolute confidence that the Lord is God. Esther found strength when she risked her life to save her people. She was just a young woman, placed in a royal palace by circumstances beyond her control. But when the time came to take a stand, she did not shrink back. She could have remained silent. She could have stayed in safety. But she stepped forward, knowing the risk, willing to face death for the sake of others. Her strength was not in her position, not in her influence, not in her resources. It was in the courage to do what was right, even when it meant standing alone. Daniel found strength when he refused to compromise. Taken captive as a young man, living in a foreign land, surrounded by pagan culture, he remained steadfast. When he was told to eat the king's food, he refused. When he was commanded to bow before the king, he refused. When he was forbidden to pray, he continued as he always had. And when he was thrown into the lion's den, his strength did not fail. He did not plead for his life. He did not renounce his faith. He stood firm, knowing that God was with him. The apostles found strength when they faced persecution. They were beaten, imprisoned, threatened, yet they did not stop preaching. They did not hide in fear. They did not waver in their mission. They rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. Their strength was not in their own willpower. It was in the presence of the Holy Spirit, the assurance that they were walking in obedience to God. Jesus found strength when he walked the road to Calvary, betrayed by one of his own, abandoned by his closest followers, condemned by the very people he came to save. He carried the cross alone. The crowd that had once cheered for him now shouted for his crucifixion. The religious leaders mocked him. The soldiers beat him. The world rejected him. Yet he did not turn back. He did not call down angels to rescue him. He did not resist the suffering that lay before him. He endured because he knew the purpose for which he had come. His strength was not in the absence of pain, but in the power of love. This is the strength that comes from standing alone. It is not found in the approval of others. It is not found in the absence of difficulty. It is found in the unwavering commitment to truth. It is the strength that does not bend under pressure, that does not crumble in the face of opposition, that does not waver when the world turns against it. It is the strength of those who have learned to rely on God alone, to trust in his promises, to walk forward even when the path is uncertain. It is the strength that changes history, the strength that transforms lives, the strength that endures beyond this world.